Okay, let's take a look at this daisy. I have this drawn. It has lots and lots of petals and lines and shadows. So how are we going to go about looking at this? It does help to look at this in real life because that's going to tell me a lot about the shadows. But for the most part, it seems like a lot of the shadows, especially down in this side here, are cool shadows, and they pretty much encompass the flower. Here's where our highlight is based on scientific lighting, but we're also catching some lighting in this area over here, and then we have shadow in here because this flower is an inverted cone, widespread but an inverted cone. So the strongest highlights are going to be over in this area. Where these petals violate that, they will be a little darker, and you can kind of see that if you squint at it. The darkest area will be down in this area here as we get into the center of the flower, and that center is a green. So when we talk about this and paint this, down in this area here, there will be quite a bit of green, even in the yellow, even in the white petals that surround it. And then in this section in here, we might see some violets and pinks, which means that you can take your botanical gray and modify it so that you can do some of the things that we did when we tested the botanical gray by changing the bias. It is really important that you draw this very accurately. I keep saying that, and I will show you what that looks like now that we have looked at this specimen. This was my first sketch for this flower, trying to get all the petals in the right place. And then what I did was I overlaid this on top of that sketch to more refine the drawing. So here we have the second step in the process. And finally, here is my finished drawing. Note that the lines are very thin, that the interior lines for the petals are a little lighter than the exterior lines, and I have even added a leaf to the bottom of this to make it a bit more interesting. So now I'm ready to transfer, and this will be ready to paint. My drawing has been transferred and I've cleaned it up, checking on all the details for the contours, so that everything is quite accurate, and I'm ready to paint. In order to paint a white flower is to paint the shadows and a few lines, but not outlines like coloring book outlines that disappear and reappear and blend into the shadows that exist within the painting itself. Now the key with white is that we work very light, because you don't want this white to get muddy. You want it to have a nice kind of fresh look to it. Now I know that I'm going to put kind of a yellowy cast shadow in this area. I'm going to put a bluish botanical gray in this area. What I'm going to do first, though, is I'm going to put a little tea wash in for where my center florets are and for where the greens are, just so that I have a little help with distinguishing shapes, because this can get quite confusing. Now for the most part, I'm going to work dry. I'm going to start by painting in this center section with a little bit of cadmium yellow pale. Also paint in my brats. And make it easier for me to see what's going on in terms of these radial petals that dominate this daisy. We probably want to paint our darkest darks first, and even though they're very dark, they're not very dark. Now that made a lot of sense, didn't it? So I'm going to take some of my botanical gray and I'm going to add just a little bit of blue to it. By the way, I'm working on Saunders hot press watercolor paper. Now you can always soften those edges just by taking your brush and just dampening it and letting that soften. Now this whole underside of the daisy is going to need some shadow.
So we're going to start fairly light. And put in shadows where we see them. I see that it gradates. We want to make sure that we do that gradation. I'm going to soften the edges.
Now I'm going to add just a little bit more blue for the shadows on the top side where I see blue. This will merge into a little side that changes to yellow. Add a little yellow to that shadow. I'm not working dry brush. I am actually working with washes. And you don't need a lot of paint. This is just working with very thin shades of color. And in a few places, I'm gently dampening the paper a little bit so that I get some additional bleed on the color. And for instance, here I would like to have a little bit more blue and let it bleed naturally into the rest of the botanical gray that I have on there. And I'm going to do the same thing here. So I've got some blues up in this area here. I think I'm almost using pure ultramarine blue, just diluted it down a bit in order to pick up those nice blues that I'm seeing in the flower itself. Now these may look like line, but in fact they are shadows. There's a lot of yellow in the shadows. For the most part, this whole painting right now is being done with degrees of botanical gray, different dilutions. At some point I'm going to put in some straight lemon yellow. Make sure if you get a hard edge that you blend it out. It's much harder once this dries. So you can see how interesting this can get just by adding some color to the flower. So at this point I'm just going to paint in this leaf using the colors that we determined were correct for this particular specimen. I've put a tea wash of green on this leaf because this is actually the underside of the leaf that is showing, and it has a very light green, almost gray-green look to the veins. So that's what I am working at replicating so that I can get some nice even washes out of it. And once this is wet, now I will go back in and I'll pick up a little bit more color and I'll start to add that into the darker areas, allowing it to merge with what's already there. Note how thin I make the veins. I want to preserve that the lightness of those veins. And what I will do, once I've gotten this value in here, I'm going to go over the whole thing again with a very light wash of green, just to tone those veins back a little bit because they seem to be screaming at me a little bit, and the whole thing will come together quite nicely. So we'll let this dry and we'll go back to doing our shadows on our daisy.